Hello, and welcome to the University of St Andrews. I'd like to extend a warm greeting to all of our alumni, students, colleagues, and friends watching from across the globe. My name's Craig Rutherford. I'm a development officer working in the areas of arts and divinity here at the university. If this is your first Saints Talk, then thanks for joining us. Our Saints Talks are short presentations by leading members of our academic community on subjects that we hope are of great interest to you. It's a little flavour of the expertise that our lucky students get to see on a daily basis. This evening's talk will be given by Dr. Bridget Bradley. The talk will last for about 30 minutes, and then Dr. Bradley will be happy to field any questions that you might have. We'll aim to wrap the event up by around 6:15 at the latest, so do please get your questions in early if you'd like to ask something. If you'd like to ask a question, then they can be added to the chat bar on your screen. And we'd rather that you please don't add your full name for data protection reasons, but do please get your questions in early as the talk's going on. Before we get to it, I'd like to do a quick plug for the next talk in the series. We've got a varied schedule of talks extending throughout the academic year, and the next one will be presented by Professor Kirsty Ball from our School of Management, and that's on the 21st of February, so you can note that in your diary. You can also access the full archive of past talks on a lot of subjects from bird migration to tackling coronavirus, and they're all on our dedicated St Andrews Alumni YouTube channel, where this talk will also become available over the next couple of days. Before that, though, let's get back to this evening's topic at hand and tonight's guest. Dr. Bridget Bradley was awarded her PhD from the University of Edinburgh in 2019, where she researched the everyday experiences of those living with compulsive hair pulling, skin picking, and other body-focused repetitive behaviours, otherwise known as BFRBs. She joined the Department of Social Anthropology at St Andrews in 2020, where she lectures on topics of global and planetary health. Bridget considers herself an applied anthropologist and is involved in ongoing advocacy work where the body-focused repetitive behaviours community are collaborating with their interlocutors to raise awareness and improve support options in the UK. Together, they're hoping to establish the first ever charity for BFRBs in the UK. Her new research continues her interest in mental health and community activism and focuses on experiences of eco-anxiety with climate activists and their families in the UK. She completed an online pilot study in 2021 and is currently applying for longer term funding to continue this work. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Bridget for this evening's talk. Bridget.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you so much to the development team for inviting me to take part in tonight's Saints Talk. It's a real pleasure to deliver some of my work to a different audience and to meet the alumni. So I'm really looking forward to your questions and the discussion that follows. As Craig said, my talk this evening is going to be looking at the relationship between mental health labels and community activism, which are the two main themes that my research has been working on really for the last 10 years or so. I'll be exploring this concept of biosolidarity with you, and don't worry, I'll try to explain it as best as I can. And really, I'm going to be comparing the two very different research examples that I've been working on over the years, the first being compulsive hair pulling and skin picking, or body-focused repetitive behaviours, or BFRBs, that some of you may or may not have heard of, and the more recent and more well-known idea of climate anxiety. So two very different research examples, but with similar questions, and really looking at how biosolidarity could perhaps be applied to both of these examples. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on all of this later on. So I'd like to begin with just an overview really of my research background, and in particular to think about what the anthropological perspective can offer. So I am a social anthropologist, but I've been working on topics of health and disease and teaching on topics of health and disease over the years. And this was really the field that sparked my interest, I think, as an early student, was how can anthropology be used in health contexts? And how can we use our methods to better understand the different experiences around the world of health, disease and illness? And so what an anthropologist might ask, the types of questions we might ask are certainly different to other fields, but I feel that our methods really in the immersive experience of anthropological research, which is to spend time with people and really get to know them, can offer a great deal. And it teaches us really that the experiences of health and illness are vastly different around the world. And so I've been applying these ideas to my work and asking different types of questions to, for example, what a psychologist would be asking, using different types of methods, and also, as we'll see, kind of bringing in my own experience to research as well. So my decision to research compulsive hair pulling, which is not the most popular topic, as you can imagine, in anthropology, it began really during my master's research in 2012 at Edinburgh University. And when faced with the task of writing a dissertation for my master's, I turned inwards and really looked at something I had been dealing with personally most of my life, but something I had never openly really spoken to anybody about. And that was my experience of living with compulsive hair pulling, or trichotillomania, as it's called in the kind of medical sphere. So I certainly did not expect for this project to turn into a PhD research project, and I absolutely did not expect it to become the basis of my academic and kind of activist career. But I'm really glad that I made that decision to actually start researching trichotillomania back then. And I conducted an online study where I was faced with interviewing and meeting other people who had hair pulling. And this was the first ever time that I had met other people who shared the same experience as me. It was something I was very secretive about in my own life. I did not disclose to my supervisor or my colleagues that this was something I was living with. And so I went through a journey of kind of meeting others and finding out what their experiences were and how it compared to my own, but realised really the vast community that was out there that was very hidden, and that people were very much living still in secrecy and in silence. But when they came together and found out that there were others just like them, it was a very powerful moment. And so this led to my PhD research, where I was asking different types of questions and doing much more in-depth fieldwork in different sites across the UK and the United States. So I was interested in the spaces that hair pulling and skin picking are experienced, private spaces in people's homes, within families, the intimate everyday experiences and challenges that people are living with when they have these behaviours, as well as clinicians, hairdressers, and a non-profit organisation. And so I was trying to look at the spaces that hadn't been approached in research and better understand, what does it actually mean to live with compulsive hair pulling? What does it look like across these different spaces? Where do people go for support, and what is on offer? And that took me in lots of interesting directions, and I'll come back to this in a little moment, and better explain what it means to live with a BFRB. And in asking questions about the naming and medical labelling and the importance of finding other people and activism, these themes have led to my more recent work looking at climate anxiety, which I'll tell you more a bit about in a moment, which was generously supported by the Scottish Funding Council. And I've received a great deal of support and enthusiasm on this project from my colleagues here at St Andrews. So it's been a pleasure to explore those new ideas, but still very early work. Okay. So what are body-focused repetitive behaviours? Normally when I do talks like this, I ask for a show of hands, but the virtual nature tonight makes that a little bit more difficult. The likelihood is that many of you will never have heard of compulsive hair pulling or trichotillomania. These are not very well known disorders at all, although there's evidence of them going right back to early medicine, and the first ever documents that were written about humans and health, there were examples of people that compulsively pulled out their hair for no apparent reason or could not stop picking their skin. We also see evidence of BFRBs in the animal world, where certain animals find it difficult to to avoid pulling out feathers or plucking out fur, or kind of incessantly pick at themselves, often creating severe damage. And so these are in many ways normal grooming behaviours for humans and animals, but I suppose what would make a BFRB a medical diagnosis is when it becomes to the extent to which our people are really affected in their everyday lives. They cannot stop pulling their hair or picking their skin despite multiple efforts to try and stop, and it then has an impact on self-esteem, social impact, and the like. And so, as I said, there's a great deal of secrecy and embarrassment and shame surrounding these behaviours. They often begin in childhood or adolescence, and so the lack of public awareness and even medical understanding about BFRBs makes it very difficult for people to manage. And the interesting thing about diagnosis is that because of the unusual nature of hair pulling and skin picking, and the embarrassment that people feel, the actually very typical experience is that people will believe that they are the only one in the world who is pulling out their hair obsessively. They don't actually think to go looking for a diagnosis because they think that they are, and these are their own words, a freak, or that it's just something weird that they do, that they don't understand and that they can't control, and they must keep a secret. And so diagnosis is rarely done by a health professional. It's often accidental, where people stumbled across a news article or a magazine article that suddenly described it, and they identified with it. And this moment of realizing they were not alone, but that there was a medical label, there was a diagnostic label, a word to attach to their experience, and a language to use, was very powerful and profoundly changed their journey with BFRBs. And unfortunately, for those that did go seeking a professional diagnosis or support, experiences really found that doctors were not very well educated about these disorders. Often they were being Googled while in the room, you know, that they'd never even heard of them before. And so people living with BFRBs, even today in the UK and the United States, there's a great deal of misinformation and underdiagnosis going on. And so people have to become their own advocates really and go looking for support. And this is where the community aspect really becomes important. And so the diagnostic labels are really crucial to BFRB experience. That idea of finding a name brings legitimacy, it brings empowerment, it makes people feel less alone, and it then provides the opportunity to go looking for others who share that label. And what's interesting about the BFRB example is that the pathological label here is actually helping people to feel more normal. They were feeling like a freak before, and now that they have this diagnosis, they feel normal. They feel like they have a medical condition, something that is recognised, that they can make sense of. And that really differs from other examples and scholarship in anthropology in a way that looks at the stigma of a mental health diagnosis and how mental health labels can move people from feeling normal to feeling abnormal, or from rational to irrational. So I think what's interesting here is that BFRB's labelling is kind of doing the opposite. And so mental health labels are empowering. They bring people together. They can reduce shame, they can reduce isolation, and that in turn can lead to forms of recovery and well-being and people feeling generally better about their experiences. And so the community activism, as I'll come to kind of look at in a moment, but really it's important to mention that in the BFRB community, activism is having a direct effect on the labels themselves. So over the years, the international BFRB community have been advocating for a change in diagnostic language in the kind of leading medical and psychiatric manuals that are used to define and distinguish different disorders. And an important example is that body-focused repetitive behaviour is actually more of a grassroots term than an official medical term. And so this is something that the community are pushing for, because at the moment they're sitting within OCD and other related disorders, and people feel that these labels don't accurately represent their experience. And so advocacy can help to change the labels as well as the labels kind of leading to active advocacy, which I think is important and interesting. Okay, so moving on a little bit to the more conceptual side of this and how I have tried to make sense of experiences of BFRBs. And one of the popular concepts in medical anthropology is the idea of biosociality. And that's really the idea that people with a shared experience of illness come together to form relationships and can help to support one another. Quite a straightforward idea, and I'm sure many of you have experienced or are aware of similar situations, that those living with breast cancer, when they connect with other people living with breast cancer, if they attend a support group for breast cancer, they're likely to form bonds of relatedness, bringing people together and helping them to cope. And so this was introduced by an anthropologist, the late Paul Rabineau, and he describes the biosociality. He uses it for the first time there. But when he's describing it, he mentions the role of activism for biosocial communities, but it's really mentioned very briefly. And so while I've found biosociality really a helpful term, certainly accounts for BFRB experiences of that idea of coming together and forming very strong bonds with people who share your experience, I feel that the concept also did not go far enough, really, and it certainly didn't account for the complexities of a biosocial group and how it works and how people work together. And the fact that activism is often viewed as an afterthought, and that's also quite, followed in some of the scholarship, is the lack of focus on activism, I found quite problematic. And so my understanding and my development of the idea of biosociality is to see biosociality as a process. And it's a process that is very fragile. It can often be fraught. There are often tensions within biosocial communities. They are not always these loving, positive, supportive spaces. And so it's important to acknowledge the challenges and frustrations within these groups. Importantly, biosocial groups don't simply just exist, and that when you receive a diagnosis, you enter into them. Biosocial groups have to be formed, and they have to be formed by people. There is a labour involved in forming them, in shaping them, in sustaining them. And importantly, they have to be found by people. So if you have a very secret and silent group like people with BFRBs, there is a process through which people have to then connect and find out that exists. Otherwise, it might not exist. It's kind of existing in a private sphere. And so activism for me, and in what I observed in the BFRB community, is absolutely crucial to this process. It's not an afterthought. It's not something that should just be mentioned briefly. It's creating the whole experience, and it's helping to sustain it. And so activism can actually make biosociality possible in the first place. And this is what helped me to develop the concept of biosolidarity. And this builds on biosociality, but it really gives emphasis and it gives attention to the relationship between activism and how biosocial groups actually come together. And I think the best way for me to explain this is through an example of one of the people that I met during fieldwork, and who has become a very, very good friend and fellow advocate. So this is Liz Atkin, a London-based artist and a woman who's been living and struggling with compulsive skin picking for almost all of her life. So Liz's story is quite remarkable. She, like me, was living in isolation and silence about her BFRB. She told no one. She would come up with extravagant stories and lies to cover up the fact that she was covered in scars from picking. She would never reveal parts of her body due to the damage that she had caused. And it wasn't until a period of her life where she was really struggling with depression and anxiety, and a friend of hers bought her a box of charcoal. So she was given a box of charcoal and a lovely notebook to draw on, and Liz began drawing on the train to work. This was a way for her to keep her hands busy and stop her from picking at her skin. Normally on the journey to work, she would be picking her face, picking her hands, picking the skin around her nails, picking her kind of chest and neck. And so by being given this, being in this very intense mental health state and having to travel to work, she used the charcoal and the notebook given by her friend to draw and try to keep her hands busy. She found that within 10 minutes she had completely filled up the notebook and run out of paper. She was frantically drawing at such a speed to keep her hands busy that she had run out of paper. And she looked around the underground train carriage and she found a newspaper. So she started drawing on the newspaper, and you can see in the picture here some of the lovely drawings that she's created. These are kind of drawing on top of images in the free newspapers on the London Underground. And Liz started to notice that other people were watching her, and they began asking questions, asking her why was she drawing. And over time, Liz was able to start telling a story about why she draws on the train, why she has to keep her hands busy at all times when she's in these kind of in-between moments where she normally picks. And she started to tell people that she had compulsive skin picking and that this was a way for her to cope. And this then turned into an act of advocacy where she started to give the drawings to passengers on the train, and she started to approach people and give them away as gifts. And with that, she would tell the story and raise awareness for skin picking along the way. Now, Liz has turned this into her career. She is a fierce advocate. She's been interviewed by people all over the world, and she's travelled the world and told her story. She really has turned this into something quite amazing. And the combination of art and advocacy for Liz, it raises awareness for skin picking, but it also creates opportunities for other people to discover that they are not alone. And this was something she told me when we met many times in London. She said that the number of times that people on the train would turn around and say, I do that. I pick my skin, I've done it forever, or I pull my hair and I don't know how to stop. And often these people had never met anybody else who did these things. They also didn't know that a name existed, that there was another community. And so Liz was able to explain, these are medical conditions, they're called this, and there are millions of people around the world that struggle. And so how I understand what Liz is doing is these are acts of biosolidarity. These are ways, small acts of activism that allow people to know that a biosocial group exists. It makes the biosocial group visible, and it creates opportunity for new biosocial connections to be made. And it's absolutely vital to the sustainability of the biosocial group and for people to really come together. And so I understand this as a circle of biosolidarity, where biosolidarity and biosociality are working together. They reproduce one another. But the main message is that activism in this example is central to the whole experience. And what Liz is doing here is a perfect example of that. Okay, so switching track a little bit, what does any of this have to do with climate anxiety? Well, the questions I was asking in the BFRB community were obviously about the importance of labels, the importance of names, how people come together, and the role of activism in all of that. And this led me into a new area of research, which is very different, but also came from personal experience. And after the birth of my first son, my increased anxiety around surrounding the climate crisis and the reality of our futures led me to reflect a little bit on that and design a new research project. So you can see the thread here of my personal experience inspiring my work. Well, eco-anxiety and climate anxiety is much better known than compulsive hair pulling, and I was really what sparked my interest was the rise of the language of eco-anxiety and being picked up in the media. And I wondered, is this a new or emerging mental health label? What does it mean to have eco-anxiety? Is this going to be the next kind of pathological label that we see in the new version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, for example? What does it mean to start branching out different forms of anxiety from general anxiety or the like? So I was interested in the labelling side of this. But obviously there are increasing discussions happening already about the mental health effects of the climate crisis, and also alongside the growing number of young people who are becoming involved in environmental activism. So what scholarship and also media articles are picking up on is the fact that there are great risks, perhaps, of increased awareness about the climate crisis, where it's causing anxiety and depression and grief and distress for many people, but particularly perhaps that young people might be at risk of this. And so there's a kind of a challenge here about how much do we talk about the climate crisis if we're worried about the mental health effects, but also what are the mental health effects of becoming involved in activism. So these were the questions that were driving this project. And I was lucky enough to get some funding in 2021 and hire a small team to do an online pilot study to talk to climate activists across the UK. We were still in lockdown, I think, at that point. So this was an online pilot study, which was quite good because I was able to interview people across the UK. We were interested in the everyday experiences of climate anxiety, the relationship to activism, and also the family dynamics of that, intergenerationally, to see what kind of parents and children were dealing with. And the findings from this pilot study revealed some really important differences to what I have found in the BFRB community. And this is where kind of the biosolidarity comes in. So first of all, there was a widespread rejection of the idea that eco-anxiety might be or should be considered a new pathological label. Now, this was very interesting for me, given what I had observed in the BFRB community, where there's a real acceptance and the label brought a lot of empowerment to people. There's a strong identification with that label. This was not happening for the people we spoke to who struggled with eco-anxiety. And their reason for that was because they very much felt that what they were experiencing, the distress and the mental health effects of what they were experiencing, was a rational response to an emergency. And so, again, we can see here the difference between perhaps people with BFRBs who feel abnormal and then get a diagnosis and feel normal. And here there's almost the reinforcement that a mental health label means that you are abnormal or irrational. And so there was a real distancing for people with that idea that there is nothing wrong with me. What is wrong is the situation, and that is it's my response to the situation that is causing this, rather than the fact that there was something wrong with them, perhaps. And this makes me think that the idea that eco-anxiety and mental health labels in this context are seen as potentially stigmatizing and negative. Another interesting finding that we discovered that contradicts a lot of the scholarship, particularly in psychology, that says that getting involved in climate activism can alleviate symptoms of climate anxiety. We found that actually getting involved in activism, while it did help people to tailor their feelings into something productive and positive, it also often created more anxiety and a sense of overwhelm. And activism could certainly lead to burnout for lots of people. And so activism does not always alleviate these experiences. It's not always seen as a positive thing. And it also did not automatically create these bonds of relatedness that I saw in the BFRB community. And so arguably, there isn't really a biosocial experience happening here, although I think that that's something I'd like to explore more in the future, is what might that look like in this context, but certainly really strong differences than what I was expecting. So through this example, it's allowed me to really rethink biosolidarity. First of all, what does it mean? What does the bio mean here? And that's something maybe we can explore in the questions. But if there is no biomedical labelling happening here in the same way, then maybe biosolidarity is not the right concept. Or maybe I need to expand my understanding of biosolidarity to think about the role that labelling and activism is having here and the potential for that to improve well-being. And perhaps I think that I just need a bit longer to dig into this topic and figure out what's going on. Now I'm just wrapping up now. I see we've got a few minutes left, but really the most important question here is, why does any of this matter? Well, of course it matters to me. I find it fascinating, but as you can probably tell, my work is very applied and I like to reflect the wider world that we're living in, and certainly the importance of research in the wider world and its contribution to the wider world. So we know that the climate crisis is also a mental health crisis. It's very clear that people are having strong psychological and emotional reactions to what is happening. And that's also just happening here in Britain, which is a country that's not really affected too dramatically yet by the climate crisis. It's also happening across the globe on a much wider scale. And alongside this, climate action, of course, is growing. But in Britain, which is the context that I study in, activism is also at risk. The political sphere and context at the moment, there's increasing risk to public protest. And so this is an important time to reflect on the role of climate action and the potential for activism to really create change. I think that anthropology has some really wonderful insights to offer this, and it allows us to think about the everyday experiences of climate activism, as well as the impact of climate activism on mental health. There's also great challenges that I haven't been able to explore much in this talk, but about family life, how families are coping with anxiety and fear around the climate crisis, how people plan and think about talking to children and young children about the climate crisis. So the family aspect is something anthropology can really offer insight into, as well as the social aspects of diagnosis. What does diagnosis look like outside of the clinical setting? What does it look like in the community? And of course, the wider political, social, cultural context, anthropology can offer important knowledge there. So for me, I think that the concept of biosolidarity has shown the importance of activism, and that when we think about people who are experiencing shared sense of health and illness, we have to absolutely give focus to activism, because activism is doing that work. It's not just an afterthought. And my understanding of biosociality and thinking about how these communities work together is also about highlighting the positive and the negative effects of activism. The fact that biosocial groups are very hard to sustain. They require labour, they require people working together. There can be tensions and there can be challenges, and it's important in order to sustain activism. And so through an understanding of all of this, we can not only better understand the mental health effects of the climate crisis, but also we can work towards figuring out how to support people so that climate action is sustainable, and that activists and the wider populations can actually do work that's meaningful to combat the climate crisis without suffering their own mental health and leading to burnout. And I think this is particularly important for young people and younger generations. So I think I'll wrap up there. Thank you. Here's my contact details in case anybody wants to talk after the event today. I'll hand back to you, Craig.
Thanks very much, Bridget. That was a really fantastic talk. There's a lot to unpack there, but it's genuinely enlightening and interesting, and that's evident in some of the questions that we've got coming through. So if you're watching, do please continue to send in your questions, and we'll try and get through as many of them as we can. Firstly, I've got a question myself that I kind of wanted to ask. It's clear from hearing you talk so passionately about it and so expertly about it that this is a subject which is of great personal as well as professional interest to you. I just wondered if you could maybe say a bit about the challenges and the benefits of working on something like this when it is so personal to you, but it's also your professional work.
Thank you. Yes, this is something that I think I'm still trying to navigate, and I'm lucky, I suppose, that I've chosen anthropology as a field, because our methods allow us to do that kind of personal reflection, and also build in using our own personal experience as a form of data in a way, so we can kind of account for our experiences, write about our experiences. But it's certainly not an easy task. I think the work of an academic already makes it very difficult to have a work-life balance, but that's even more so difficult and a challenge when your research is based on personal experience. So there's certainly challenges to it, but I think the benefits outweigh the challenges, and I've been incredibly privileged to be able to do the activist work that I am doing and developing support groups for BFRBs, and hopefully getting this charity off the ground as well. So I think that the value, it reminds me that our academic work is not contained to a university or to an academic journal. It's making a difference in real lives, in everyday lives, and that's what keeps me going and motivates me. I think that that's the most important impact that my work will ever have, and that's important to recognise it.
Thank you. It's really interesting. And I suppose sort of aligned to that, how do you manage to combine your advocacy alongside your research work? I mean, it must be a challenge to manage both of them. And do you try and separate them, or is it something they feed off each other? There must be a lot of there's a porous wall between the two, I guess, for you. But I mean, is that problematic?
It is definitely. I think just in terms of time management, I find that it makes the working day very difficult to define. But I think they go hand in hand, really. And the hardest thing, I suppose, is knowing when the research ends. And because technically my research with the BFRB community has ended, but the advocacy work is ongoing. So I suppose my problem is that every day when I'm talking to my colleagues, I think, oh, this is so interesting, and I have to remind myself, no, I'm not doing research with them today, you know, and so I have to switch off that part of my brain. But it's good because it means that creative ideas are always flowing and that future work can develop. So it's
right. I'm interested. Do we know what the prevalence of BFRBs is across the population, or is that because it's not properly medically defined yet, or because we've not got to that point? Is that hard to say?
It is hard to say in some ways because people are unlikely to come forward, but there's been estimates based on several different population-wide studies, and they say that it's 1 in 25 people has a BFRB to the extent that it interferes with daily life, which is a phenomenal number. And that's the interesting thing, is that cross-cultural and kind of global studies have also shown that it's not just a problem for kind of Euro-American societies. You see evidence of BFRBs across the world. And I think the way that people deal with it and manage it and understand it obviously varies, but it's fascinating. It's a human-wide problem. Yeah.
We've got a question that's come through from an anonymous person, but it's something that I definitely knew was going to come up, and I was going to ask it myself if it didn't. Do you think COVID and kind of the associated lockdowns have had an impact on BFRB? And I guess this is in the question, but an impact on climate anxiety or eco-anxiety as well?
Yes, definitely. So I wrote I've got an article in the process that isn't finished yet, but I wrote a nice little blog piece about this actually that you could Google and find out. During lockdown, I was obviously reflecting on the impact on the BFRB community. I run support groups for the BFRB community, and they were in person, of course, before the pandemic, and we had to move everything online during COVID. And the reflection during that time of the extent to which people were really struggling during lockdown, in the same way that everybody was, but being at home and I think with family and immersed in a way, there was no escape from your BFRB. So it was very intense for lots of people. There was rising anxiety and experiences there, but there was also the flip side of that, where people found it a lot easier to manage because the everyday challenges that they had of getting out of the house or trying to keep their hair loss and scars hidden in different social contexts were no longer a problem. So they were able to kind of hide on Zoom as long as their kind of neck upwards was fine, and the rest of the time they were felt much more comfortable. So there was interesting differences. And in terms of climate anxiety, I think it's interesting to see how different crises overlap. I think people on the one hand felt that there was a less attention being given to the environmental crisis because of the pandemic, although I would argue they're deeply connected. But at the same time, people being at home and doing the kind of walks in nature around about their local houses allowed people to reconnect with the natural world closest to them, which was in a way helpful. But I found it really interesting to do interviews with people during the lockdown, and COVID was mentioned by everybody. We were asking, you know, what the impact on that was, but yeah, that's interesting. It was really interesting to follow.
And you mentioned that you'd done a kind of, or that was a pilot study on the eco-anxiety stuff. Do you know anything about the kind of future direction of your research or other research in that area? Is there kind of future planning going on?
Yeah, it's definitely a very popular topic at the moment. There's a great deal of researchers kind of interested in and looking into this, mostly from psychology, though very few anthropologists as yet. Certainly from my own point of view, yes, I'm in the process of kind of designing and applying for longer term funding, because as an anthropologist, the online study was great, but I want to get out in the world and I want to do fieldwork with people and kind of get those everyday immersive experiences that fieldwork involves. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to secure some funding and do a much longer term study and figure out what's going on.
Great, that would be really good. We've got a question from Addy, who says, you mentioned that there's a lack of emphasis on the role of activism in bonds formed through biosociality. Do you think that activism goes understudied in research on other kinds of social relationships, including, you know, economic and family and political, etc.? Is that something that needs more work?
I think there is a lot of research on activism in general. From an interdisciplinary perspective as well. I mean, I think different fields there's a growing interest in it. So I don't think there's a lack of research as much. I think it's just interesting that in that side of things, when you're looking at biosociality, it's just evident that there was a real kind of absence of activism. And sometimes I think when we use concepts again and again and they become very popular in certain disciplines, we don't push them far enough. We allow them to speak for themselves. And so I think it's important to reflect on these theoretical ideas and say, okay, what does this actually look like in the real world? You know, it's very well to call it biosociality, but just to kind of push it a bit further and say, well, what does it mean to actually create a group like that? What's the work involved? And again, I think that was why I was able to reflect on my own experience of setting up support groups alongside the research, and the toll that takes on a community of keeping that work going is very intense. So again, that's about reminding ourselves that when we come up with concepts like this, we have to think about the kind of lived experience that lies underneath the theory. It helps us to make sense of it.
We've had quite a few questions coming on BFRB, so I'm going to roll a few into one, if that's all right. So Ivan has asked, is there evidence of people who self-diagnose and rightly or wrongly associate their behaviour with people who've got a professional assessment or diagnosis of BFRBs? And could you, someone else, Susan has asked, could you say a bit more about why the BFRB community doesn't necessarily identify as associated with OCD, or do they? And other one was, someone has asked if we can share details of your support groups for BFRB. So I don't know if that was on your presentation, I think possibly, but yeah, so what's the relationship or not with OCD, and are people self-diagnosing with this kind of thing?
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, great questions, and I'm really glad that people are interested in BFRBs, because every time I talk about it, I feel like it's an act of biosolidarity. I'm able to kind of tell another audience that these things exist and that many people are struggling and where to go for help. So that's great. in terms of self-diagnosis, I think people are self-diagnosing, and I think that's okay. I think diagnosis is not an expert field. People should be allowed to make sense of their own lived experience and self-identify. And I think many health professionals would agree. So I think that if it allows people to make sense of their experience of health and illness and then send them on the journey towards getting the right help and support, then I'm all for that. In terms of OCD, this is a really interesting one because trichotillomania and dermatillomania, which is what skin picking is often called, they've moved categories over the years, and there's an interesting kind of journey that they've made. They were previously, well, skin picking was never in the DSM, which is the psychiatric manual for mental disorders, until 2013. So officially, medically, it wasn't even recognised as a mental health disorder until very recently. And so people living with skin picking, you know, are kind of outraged at that. So its inclusion was really important. But also what happened in 2013 was that hair pulling and skin picking moved categories from impulse control disorders to OCD and related disorders. So there was some recognition of this category better represents the community, but for members of the community, it still didn't really go far enough. And that's because although there are a lot of overlaps, people really just want to be in their own family category, and that family category that makes sense to them is body-focused repetitive behaviours. So they very much believe that they should be in their own classification group. But that being said, there are many overlaps, and there's often comorbidity where people have OCD and a BFRB, as well as other disorders. So it's very complex, and each individual case will be different. But I think it's more about being recognised in their own group rather than being kind of added on or tagging on to somebody else's group is really the main thing. And there was another question.
Oh, sorry. It was it about the OCD and why that does or doesn't people do or don't associate with OCD, and then
sorry, I've forgotten that.
And the piece about people who are self-diagnosing was the two there. But there was also a question about I know I asked about the prevalence earlier on, but someone was asking around whether it's more prevalent in younger or older people, or what the kind of age spread is for BFRBs, if that's something you have data on.
Yes, I think I don't have specific numbers to hand, but I think certainly childhood, well, adolescence, and kind of the average age where it tends to begin is about average of 13. So it certainly can be much worse in those kind of early years. But perhaps just with the level of support, I think that people can get, it can improve over into adulthood, but not always. So yeah, I'm not sure if there have been kind of studies that map the different age ranges and prevalence, but there have certainly with gender, and there's a suggestion that women tend to suffer more from hair pulling and less so men. But again, I think that's about not really knowing if people are coming forward. Skin picking disorder looks like it's much more 50-50 in terms of a gender breakdown. That reminds me about the third question that I forgot about, which is about the support group and how to find details about that. So yes, we have I can certainly share details. Generally, our online support group meets fortnightly on a Sunday afternoon. So if anybody wants to email me, I can send details about that, and we're running one this Sunday, so I'll be hosting that this Sunday.
Great, thank you for that. I'm just going to finish off with a comment from Greg, who said he doesn't have a question, but he has a thank you. So I think that's something that we all agree with. So I think we're coming towards the end of our time, so I'm just going to wrap up and say that, you know, a big thank you to Bridget for a thoroughly interesting talk. It's really great to get these insights into the research and kind of passions of our academics. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us on the subject, about which you're both passionate and clearly world leading as well. So I can tell from the volume of questions that's really struck a chord with people. So that's Great, thank you very much for doing that. And also I'd just like to do a quick thank you to all the staff who've given their time to make arrangements for this event. It's there's a lot of work that goes into these, and it's very much appreciated by all of us. And finally, a big thank you to you, our esteemed alumni, students and staff and friends for attending this talk. We're delighted to be able to welcome you virtually back to St Andrews every few weeks. So please do continue to attend these events. And as I said, our next talk is on the 21st of February, and that will be by Professor Kirsty Ball from the School of Management. But with that, that's just like to say thanks very much for coming along to us, and we look forward to seeing you again. So enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, Craig.
Cheers.